Hi, good morning. Welcome back to Butterfly Magic with Hot Tea. I have a really good book to recommend. This is by David Brooks, and it is How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. Okay, and it comes with an accompanying workbook right here. So if you're going to buy both, of course, you're going to start with this one. Now, this I have not gone through meticulously at all. It does have, it's written with like spaces and lines and, room to sort of work through your written answers. It goes through key lessons that stem from his text. So I haven't gone through that. I can't really comment on that right now. But I appreciate this book because of what it brings. It's a different kind of a book. In that he is, though he is not a psychologist, he is not coming from a mental health professional kind of perspective steeped in theory. It looks like he is coming from someone who is a keen observer. He's a keen observer, and he has really collected a lot of information about how to listen to people and how to bring out the best from somebody else in a conversation so that they feel heard, right? So, the reason why I appreciate that is people want to be heard and nobody's doing any listening. So, it's not a program that really works, right? So, how do you listen? Um, so, the book itself is written in three parts. The first part, I'm just going through the table of contents here briefly. The first part is I See You, with 7 chapters there. The I See You is essentially really letting somebody know that you're here to hear them and how to listen to them, the kind of listener you want to be. The part 2 is I see you in your struggles. So you're looking at who they are, how their journey has been, what their life has been like, and what brings them to this point in their life to try and understand what has shaped what they're doing and how they see the world, their worldview. The third part, chapters 13 to 17, is I see you with your strengths. And I appreciate that approach. Now, a strength-based approach reminds me of what I do um, in my profession as a really strength, like a solution-focused kind of an approach. Seeing somebody for their strengths helps them to move from point A to point B. And sometimes what we think are our struggles, we can transform them into like recognizing the resilience and the strength it takes to get through that and transform from that struggle. And then it's important to highlight the strength that you have to have gone through all these struggles that you've been through to get from point A to point B. That then becomes a lesson learned in life, and then you get to see patterns in retrospect when you see these sort of struggles coming up again. It's like, oh yeah, I've gone through this program before. I have the strength. I know I can do this, and I know how because I know what hasn't worked before. So I know how to go through this. So that's really an important point that he draws on. Okay, so in a nutshell, if you want to know about the book, that's it. Now, from this point forward, I'm going to try and give some kind of a summary on the chapters and highlight what I thought was relevant. Okay, so to look at some of the more salient points in the first 3 chapters. He talks about the importance of being seen. You know, why is it important to be seen in a conversation? Um, and not being seen is really painful. He says there's no crueler punishment than to not see someone, to render them unimportant and invisible. He then talks about the kind of listeners that he observes. So he talks about diminishers, people who kind of reduce you when they're listening to you. He points out egotism, anxiety, because you might not be able to listen to somebody because of your own anxiety, your you know, naive realism, the lesser mind problem, objectivism, essentialism, which just making generalizations, and the static mindset. To find out more about what those are, that's I encourage you to read the book. So he's really sort of giving it a bit of an academic approach that's not theory based. It's more observational. Then he talks about the illumination. So, person who is an illuminator is a person who listens and really shines a light on the person they're listening to. So they will listen with a different mindset. They listen with what he calls the illuminator's gaze, with tenderness, receptivity, active curiosity. So you're asking questions and really genuinely being present. Um, Affection, generosity, and a holistic attitude. So seeing the whole person. Uh, for me, that sounds a lot like not being judgmental, being quite accepting, and interested with that active curiosity. And there's ways to do that. So I like that he's taking the experiential sort of non-academic approach to being a good listener. I've learned ways to be a good listener um, because that's my job as a therapist in my life, and that is tied into having an actual professional skill set that um, you need to, like, psychotherapy basically is a protected practice, right? So you want to be able to have general skills of how to listen without stepping into the realm of becoming a therapist, because that's really only for people who have developed those skills and are authorized to use those skills. So, from an experiential perspective, we don't learn how to be good listeners in school. And I think it would be ideal if we could practice these active listening skills from, like, at every grade level as an exercise, just like you would, learn any other subject in school. Social skills are really, really important. Okay. Um, let's move on to the remainder of the first part. Okay. So chapter 4, he's talking about accompaniment. Here he's saying that doing things with somebody is a good way to understand them more and to listen to them more and to be present for them. So, your activities of daily living, just the mundane, everyday stuff that you do together, um, accompanying them, being with them, and being a presence in their life. Be patient. He talks about patience. He talks about being playful. He talks about being centered on somebody other than yourself. So he calls that other centeredness, and showing up for somebody with compassion. One thing that he brings up in the chapter 5 is the way to look at a person. He has an analogy where he says, okay, a person who's an interior decorator and who looks at a room is going to see the potential in that room. He's going to see, the design of that room. He's going to see the history of that room quite differently than somebody who, for instance, is, I believe, an architect, or somebody who's looking at it from a safety perspective to, how to safety up the room. Um, that's a great analogy because depending on who you are is going to condition how you see somebody else and vice versa. So I really like that analogy. Um, then he elaborates on constructivism, which basically a person will construct or sort of perceive the world um, according to their own reality. So, based on what you've learned, that's going to condition how you see the world. It's going to condition your worldview. So, to be aware of that, not only for somebody else, but also for yourself. This is really relevant stuff. In chapter 6, he's talking about how to be a good listener, and also how to be a good conversationalist. So, be a witness to their story. Um, One really relevant skill that I use is what he's calling looping. And that is the paraphrasing and the summarizing of what somebody says. So this is where you hear their narrative, their whatever it is they're sharing in the conversation, and then you reflect back by summarizing or paraphrasing or getting the gist of what they're saying, and and then checking and saying, did I get that right? So that's that's something that that's it's a salient feature in listening skills. When you're doing that, you don't want to kind of pass judgment. You don't want to add your own information, your own kind of value system, or put a tone in there like, "Oh, is that what you're saying?" So I like the way that he talks about um, really meticulously going into these listening skills to find common ground also and to shift the attention away from yourself. In chapter 7, he's talking about the kind of questions that you want to ask somebody. So when you say something like, "Where did you go to school? What college did you go to?" That kind of question can be really loaded with judgment on the receiving end. Because it sounds like, okay, I'm getting ready to judge you according to the school that you went to, whether it's good enough in my book. That doesn't mean that you will. It may just genuinely be a kind of a question that you ask, but depending on the listener, that might be coming, that might come across. So he talks about conditioning the questions to be more open ended. Like, how did you get through school? Or what was it like to? And tell me about the school that you went to, or, what was your experience like? Um, in what ways did you? In what ways did you? So it's very open ended, very somebody's likely to want to discuss and not just kind of give a one word answer, a yes, no, or give the name of the school, give the correct answer in 2 words or less, but to elaborate on what their experience was like. And then you're going to get a lot more qualitative information, and that's because of the questions that you've chosen. Um, and that's part of being a good listener. So then David Brooks, the author, talks about struggles in part 2. So part 2 starts at chapter 8. He talks about an epidemic of blindness where we really don't see each other for the experiences that we go through. There's animosity, there's disconnection, there's distrust, there's loneliness, and that's kind of become our new normal. The loneliness is problematic. The widespread mental illness, which is, predominantly depression, is really very common. And he links that to the rates of suicide and mass shootings and aggression. Um, and I think rightfully so. I mean, there's definitely something that we can do about that. Um, yeah, there's definitely, if I'm going to make my own sort of insertion, this is not something that he says, I'm going to say, instead of blaming government, blaming, external factors, but taking on our own sort of responsibility to listen to and to nurture and to be present for the people who are around us, to let them know that they do matter and to help them and support them when they're going through periods of alienation and isolation at work or at school, to be open to listening to those stories. That's really relevant because there's only so much that external agencies can do. Um, they don't always have eyes on the individual people like we do. So that's my own inference in there. But he does make a link between the lack of connection and the really sad, horrific events that we've been seeing more frequently. So again, in chapter 9, he's talking about having hard conversations. So introducing with compassion, um, the questions and listening to other people based on how they're experiencing the world. He also has another analogy here where he talks about going uphill with a heavy backpack, as opposed to not having a heavy backpack and perhaps being more fit. So this analogy is sort of like, how do we go through life, depending on your worldview, depending on the sort of the struggles that you've gone through, your life circumstances. This is going to condition how you go uphill going through life, and how you perceive things. Um, so chapter 10, he's talking about how to be a friend who's going through despair and how to be supportive. Telling them to look on the bright side and be appreciative is not helpful. Um, So, how to be there and to be kind of on their side and supportive to them. More about that in chapter 11 when he's talking about the art of empathy. The art of empathy here, he goes into different points like avoidance. Avoidance is basically, he likens that to fear. It comes from fear. Deprivation, which is my needs won't be met. Overreactivity, which is you have a high threat detection, and passive aggression, which is anger, emotion, and manipulation. Now, I understand this chapter because I look at it through the lens of polyvagal theory, which you might want to look at that, Stephen Porges. I can understand what he's talking about, but he's not coming from a theory base. He's talking about just observing what he sees. So in that way, it's really keen. But when I'm reading this, I understand it because when you're coming from a fear based and you feel under threat, you have your dorsal vagal sort of response, which is flight or fight, and or just total withdrawal, and you stop reacting. So, in that way, how can you be a good listener? And also, you need to understand that to be able to understand where the other person's coming from. Because if they are all prickles and stings, they may be coming from a place of fear as well. So if you react to that fear with fear, with anger, with aggression, then you just have a whole back and forth thing that's not really helpful at all. So somewhere, somebody has to be calm and secure and compassionate, and that's not always easy, especially when we're not taught to do so. We don't know how to do that. Yeah, so this book is really pretty helpful that way. Okay, so chapter 12 is more about how you were shaped by your suffering, understanding what other people go through, and being that illuminator kind of listener. Part 3 starts at chapter 13, and it does talk about ocean, which is a measure of traits, the big 5. And so that's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. That's definitely something, if you're interested, you can look that up online. That's readily available. There are scales to understand other people based on these features. So I like that he's using some strategic sort of theory based um, um, listening skills, I guess, some theory based understanding to incorporate with his listening skills here. He talks about life tasks as well. And what he means by life tasks is the things you want to accomplish in life don't always follow the same order. So you may have children before you get married. You may buy a house before or after or instead of getting married. Um, you may go to school later on in life. You may go through some sort of events or struggles in, your early adulthood, and then start doing what other people have done at 20 and 25, only later in life. And all of that is okay. Um, your journey is your journey. Uh, the days of always kind of having a set program of you finish high school, you go to school for 2 or 4 years, and then you work in one company until you're 65, you retire, you look at your watch, you rock on your chair until you're whatever, um, until your end of days, and then you have this number of kids and your grandkids, and this is the program with the white picket fence. I mean, that's we can't hold ourselves to that. That's not realistic. It's not even ideal, really, not for everyone. So he talks about these life tasks and these different periods of life that people go through at different stages, and to be appreciative and understanding of that variety. Um, I also really appreciate here in chapter 14, he's bringing in the work of Erik Erikson, in terms of integrity and despair as a developmental stage. I like the idea of understanding adult development, um, and the stages of development that we go through as we mature as adults. And so I see vestiges of that in chapter 14. The reason why I appreciate that is having studied early childhood education. We see developmental stages in the early years, which, from kindergarten, from preschool until high school, there are developmental stages that have been identified and studied to the nth degree. Erik Erikson is one of those. Piaget, and anyways, the list um, is exhaustive with the studies that have been done for developmental stages at every month, every year, for children under the age of 18. From adulthood until forever, until the end of days, there are other developmental stages that have not been um, as studied. And I like that he's looking at, there's vestiges of that in here. Now maybe I'm just seeing what I want to see, but he's likening these developmental stages into adult life. Um, I'd like to see more of that in books in general. That's my own 2 cents there. Okay, so then he's talking about in chapter 15 life stories. How can I summarize that? Well, perhaps I'm not going to summarize that, I guess. That's what I've decided. He does identify the pragmatic model, a narrative model, and an inner voice. And within that, he does have a really good narrative about how to get evidence, to be really kind of scientific in your listening skills and the way that you might see the world as an effective listener. So I like that. Chapter 16, he's talking about the ancestors uh, that have definitely gone before you, how they have lived their lives, and how that has shaped who you are based on culture, based on where they chose to live, based on how they chose to live, the careers that they've had. So essentially, the people who have gone before you have had some sort of influence on who you are and the opportunities that you have today. Um, then the last chapter, chapter 17, he talks about wisdom, seeing the whole person for who they are, who they have been, where they're going, and to enter it all. Basically, the thread that goes through the entire book is to listen with compassion and understanding. So I thoroughly appreciate thoroughly appreciate this book. Um, because it shows that you don't need to have a really scholarly sort of, stick to this regimen to be an effective listener. Um, you can go through these listening skills and get a lot from him. Um, and I can't see going through this without developing and enhancing your compassion and your empathy for other people. I'm curious about what's in this workbook, So definitely just wanted to mention that it's something that accompanies, and I believe it would be really worth going through and exploring. So if you have gone through the workbook, if you have read this book, please leave your comments down below. I'd love to hear what you thought about it. And onward and upward. Thanks for listening. Take care.